Good morning. Those of you who were here several weeks ago, just want to make sure you understand this stool does not mean what you think it means today. I'm going to use it for something else. Am I on? Lee, have you got me? I don't feel the usual echo. I feel the love from the people, but not the echo there we go. All right, do I need to say all of that again? This stool does not mean what you think it means. This is the last week of the series we've been doing on idolatry that I've called Idol Factory. And we have really, over the last couple of months, we've covered a lot of territory as we have unpacked and explored all the different implications of what is maybe the most consistent message throughout the Bible. It can be summarized in 3 words. Don't worship idols. You get that all the way through the story of the Scriptures. Idolatry is bad for you. It's bad for you. It's bad for the world. Whether it is worshiping a created thing rather than the Creator, organizing your life around something other than God, or whether it is creating your own image of God meant to represent God and then worshiping that image, that human-made image of God, rather than God Himself, letting God be God. The Bible says over and over and over again, in all its various forms, idolatry is bad. And when we worship idols, all kinds of bad things happen. But this morning, I want to point out one exception to this rule. I want to call your attention to the one time it is both acceptable and desirable to worship an idol. But first, a story. For centuries, the old man of the mountain was the most recognizable, the most famous rock face, not only in New Hampshire, but probably in all of New England. It was an outcropping of rocks that, when you looked at it from a certain angle, looked like the profile of a wise old man. And you may notice that I'm speaking of the old man of the mountain in the past tense, because in 2003, in the middle of the night, the unthinkable happened. The old man's face fell off, which is what tends to happen when you get older. Gravity takes a toll. And even though he was in desperate need of a facelift, the state of New Hampshire could not afford one. And so now the old man of the mountain lives on in memories and stories and photos, in images, even the ones that are still on the New Hampshire license plates today. And this morning what I want to do is I want to read you a story about the old man of the mountain. It's based on an original tale by Nathaniel Hawthorne, but it's been adapted for our purposes here today. It's called The Great Stone Face. The stool is here because today is story time with Wade. As long as New Hampshire eyes had looked up to the mountains, the great stone face had stared back down in stony thought. And no one's eyes had looked up more than those of Ethan. He could imagine the stone eyelids opening, and sometimes he waved a shy greeting. And on this day, the wind was rushing down from the face, flashing the maples to gold, and pushing Ethan back into the village. Hardly a village, really, more a collection of frame houses. And one last gust, and Ethan hunched his coat around himself and looked back over his shoulder. "Are you watching then, just like him?" Pastor Hooper said as he came out for his late afternoon walk. "Him?" Ethan asked. "The great stone face." The pastor turned to the face that glowed in the lowering sun. "With the light just so, he seems to watch. You know the prophecy. Ethan nodded. Yes, someone will be born hereabouts who will look just like the great stone face, and he will be the noblest person of his time. But no one believes it anymore. Well, count me as one of the believers, said Pastor Hooper, and passed on into the village. The very next day, news came that Augustus McBride was returning to town. Before Ethan was born, he had left to seek out his fortune, and now his bulky-bottomed ships filled warehouses from Boston to Bath with furs skinned from the Arctic, ivory culled from Africa, and whale oil harpooned from all the seas of the earth. And more astonishing still, it was said that the face of Augustus McBride was the very image of the great stone face. Augustus McBride sent a skilled and clever architect to build a proper mansion to hold him. And none of the villagers doubted that the prophecy would come true at last. And when the mansion was finally completed, and just as the orchard started to bud, the great man came. Ethan waited on the common to see him, and though the sun shone warmly, he shivered with the thrill and could not help but glance often at the great stone face that watched so thoughtfully. He felt the granite smile break upon the village, and he knew it must be for Augustus McBride. The rumble of wheels, the snorting of horses. "Here he comes!" cried a boy on the edge of the village. "Augustus McBride himself!" And the villagers pressed forward, Ethan with them, as a carriage rushed up to the common. The driver reared the horses to a halt, and Augustus McBride opened the shade and looked out. "It is himself, Augustus McBride! The prophecy has come true at last!" But as the villagers surged to the carriage, Ethan stood alone, puzzled. He saw a wizened face, a face shrunken, as if in all his grasping, Augustus McBride had himself been grasped and wrung out. When he reached from the carriage to drop copper coins to the shouting villagers, his fingers were curved into a claw. No one but Ethan noticed this. The villagers followed Augustus McBride's dust to escort the great man to his mansion. Their cries echoed back, "The great stone face has come at last!" But Ethan looked up to the mountain and then turned to his own home. Near the end of Genesis chapter 1, we're told that as God is finishing or completing his creation, he creates human beings in his image. Male and female, he created them, and in God's image, God created them. What does it mean to be created in God's image? For centuries, professional and amateur theologians and philosophers have wrestled with that question. What does it mean to say that we, human beings, are created in the image of God? Does it mean that we look like God? But how can that be if God is spirit? Can we infer what God is like by observing what human beings are like? Or are we to assume that God has a sense of humor because we find jokes funny? One of the dangers of this kind of speculation is that usually our answers tell us more about ourselves than about God. And we end up creating God in our own image rather than understanding what it means to be created in the image of God. And creating God in our own image is just another form of idolatry. And while the storyteller in Genesis 1 never gives us all the answers we want, what it means to be created in the image of God, he does tell us why. He explains to us the purpose behind humanity being created in the image of God. Let's read Genesis 1, verse 26. It says, "Then God said, 'Let us make humankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over the livestock and all the wild animals and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Now, there's several details worth noting in this passage. The first, if we go back to verse 26, in the original language, the word that is translated as image in verse 26 is translated elsewhere in the Old Testament as idol. This word here, tselem, can be translated as an image. It's an image, or it can be a statue or a cast idol. The word is used to refer to an image or a statue or an idol intended to represent a god. And normally when we read this word in the Old Testament, it's used in a negative context. The word idol is almost always negative. For example, in Numbers 33, it says, drive out all the inhabitants of the land, destroy all their carved images and their cast idols. And there's that word, same word used for image in Genesis 1. Also in Ezekiel, another example. Ezekiel 7, they took pride in their beautiful jewelry and used it to make their detestable idols. There's that word again. They made it into vile images, therefore I will make it a thing unclean for them. So normally the word idol is negative, but in Genesis 1, when this word shows up, it's translated as image, maybe to avoid the connotation of it being negative, but it's the same word for idol. When God creates human beings in God's image, God is creating images of God's self to put in the world. God is creating idols of God's self, God's idols, to place in the world to represent God. And notice the connection between being created in the image of God to ruling over the rest of creation. Why does God create us as God's idols? To represent God in creation, so that we then can rule over everything else in creation. Now, in the ancient world, people would build their temples to honor their gods, and when the temple was complete, they would place within that temple an image or a statue or an idol of their god to represent the presence of God in their temple. But in Genesis 1, God is the one creating a temple. Heavens and the earth, all of creation, we've talked about this before, all of creation is a temple for the Lord. And as he's bringing his construction project to completion, God places within this new temple he's created images, statues, idols of God's self to represent God in his temple, the world. Also in the ancient world, it was common for kings to erect statues or images, idols of themselves in the far-flung regions of their empire, so that people would always know who was in charge. Those images were a reminder of the king's authority in the empire, so that as people were going through their daily business, they see the image, they see the idol, they see the statue in the center of town. They know who's in charge of it all. So what do we have in Genesis 1? We have God as creator king, creating a world, a temple for God's self, and then establishing his kingdom, his reign over his creation, and he's placing within his creation, his temple, his kingdom, images, idols, statues, meant to represent God in the world. Why? So that these walking, talking, living, breathing statues, these idols of God, can rule over creation on behalf of God. That is, humanity images God in the world, creation flourishes. Creation's well-being depends on humanity being the image of God in the world. As humanity goes, so goes creation. Because humanity represents God, represents what God is like in the world. Back to the story. Years went by, and Augustus McBride died not long after his wealth had disappeared. And now the villagers said that the wizened face of the ruined merchant had never matched the gentle majesty of the great stone face. Ethan had his own farm, and day by day he worked the land with tender hands, curving furrows around the hillsides, lugging stones to walls, carrying water during drought, sharing his plenty during harvest. At dusk he sat on his porch, weary, and watched the glow on the great stone face. The village had grown larger. Its main street boasted a line of brick and clapboard houses, as well as a stone courthouse. Each spring, the villagers met there to decide the town's course for the next year, and many a soul waited to hear what Ethan said before they made up their own minds. He would stand, his face thoughtful, and pause a moment before speaking, and then with deep and rumbling words, he spoke wisdom and peace. But one summer, when the great stone face showed white with the heat, word came that stirred the village again. Years ago, one of the villagers had marched away to fight in the wars, and he had become old blood and thunder, a great general. Now hobbled by old wounds and weary of rolling drums, he returned to the village. And those who had known him as a boy swore that he looked so like the great stone face, even then, that he must be the fulfillment of the prophecy. When the general's aide, traveling through the village, was struck by how the face resembled his commander, all were sure the prophecy had come true. The general arrived in a black coach, and the villagers so crowded around him that Ethan could not see his face. At the common, a platform had been erected with flags and bunting, and there the great man sat down to a banquet in his honor. "It is the same face to a hair," cried one of the villagers. "Why, the great stone face is nothing but old blood and thunder himself on the mountain." And Ethan felt the great stone face's eyes upon the village, and he knew that they were especially watching old blood and thunder. The crowd hushed as the great man stood to speak. Ethan saw the sparkle of metals, and then straining to his tiptoes, he saw the general's face. It was not what the villagers had claimed. Here was a face war-worn and stern. None of the gentle wisdom that shone from the great stone face was there. "This is not the man," sighed Ethan, and he made his way out of the crowd. So the order of creation is there's God above all, and then God creates human beings in God's image, and then God creates everything else. So that humanity created in God's image is below God but over everything else in creation. Humanity created in God's image is created to worship God and rule over creation. One of the reasons idolatry messes everything up, though, is when we worship created things instead of the Creator, we're placing something from creation over us instead of God. One of the reasons idolatry is bad is it betrays our allegiance to our Creator. It also forfeits our special status as the image bearers of God. For as we worship God, we're basking in the glory of God, and we receive that glory and it fills our hearts, and then we reflect God's glory out into creation. And God is worshipped, and creation flourishes when humanity, created in the image of God, does what we are created to do. But when we turn away from God and we worship an idol, we cut ourselves off from God's glory. And we cease to reflect the glory of God into creation the way we were created to. In other words, we cease to be fully human. If we define human beings as those who are created in the image of God and reflect God's image into creation, we cease to be fully human and become less than. Idolatry darkens our heart and twists our souls. The image of God is marred and scarred and distorted in us. So we no longer reflect God's glory as image bearers. Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 1. He says in chapter 1, verse 21, he says, "For although they," talking about humanity, "although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him." So they stopped worshiping God. "But their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. And although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles." That's idolatry. Instead of worshiping God, they worship idols. "Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another." They lost control. They ceased to have the dignity of human beings created in the image of God. And they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. When we lose our humanity, when we give it over to idols, we suffer, but so does creation. Later on in Romans 8, Paul will say that creation itself is actually groaning, in part because human beings are no longer functioning properly as God's idols in the world. We're no longer representing the image, the likeness of God in the world, and now all of creation suffers. What we need, what creation needs more than anything, is to have the image of God restored in humanity. More years sped quietly away. While old Blood and Thunder rushed to new slaughters, Ethan married and had more children than he could hold at once. He watched his village grow into a town, cultivated his land to fertile harvests, built a home with his wife and houses with his neighbors, sorrowed and laughed with all he knew. His life was a stream that watered wide green banks all along its course, and every soul in the town who saw him smiled. Ethan did not see the smiles, though. He went on his way, children, his own and others, hanging off him, stopping at the common to speak to old Pastor Hooper, pausing at the town well to drink a cold drink of water with a neighbor, turning into the dry goods store to read the Gazettes up from Boston. One wintry day, when cold sunlight fell on the frozen ground, Ethan read that Trumbull Bounderby was coming to the town. Like Augustus McBride and Old Blood and Thunder, Trumbull Bounderby had lived in the valley under the great stone face. He too left, not to gather gold or to win wars, but to become a name. And he had done it. Crowds listened to him, whether he spoke sweetly of peace or sternly of war. He blustered on many a local common in halls of state across the country and even in Europe. His listeners marveled at his words that floated like a bright fog. And the banquet for Old Blood and Thunder was nothing compared to the festival planned for Trumbull Bounderby. Banners flew from every house. Portraits of the great stone face smiling at Trumbull Bounderby were printed and set up in every store window. Everyone gathered at the railroad tracks to greet the great man. And as the train clamored into the station, a band began to play. And when Trumbull Bounderby himself appeared at the head of the steps, his face held a smile. There! Look at Trumbull Bounderby and see if he is not the great stone face. The great stone face has met his match at last. But as Ethan looked at the smiling man, he did see something of the old face on the mountain. There was the strength. But in Trumbull Bounderby, Ethan saw a man who performed for airy fame. Confess it, is he not the very image of the great stone face? Neighbor, answered Ethan. I see no real likeness. And he turned away. So if idolatry cuts us off from the glory of God and therefore mars and scars and distorts the image of God in us so that we no longer function properly as human beings created in the image of God, and if the result of that is creation itself is groaning and suffering, then one of the purposes of the gospel is to restore our humanity by restoring in us the image, the likeness of God. But before God can restore God's image in us, God must first show us what a properly functioning human being created in the image of God looks like. Enter Jesus. This is how the Apostle Paul describes him in Colossians chapter 1. It says in verse 15, the Son, speaking of Christ, the Son is the image of the invisible God. Dare we say the Son is the idol of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation, for in him all things were created. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in Christ, and through him to reconcile to himself all things. Christ is fully God. The fullness of God dwells in Christ. And yet Christ is also the true human being, the original human being, the ultimate human being who perfectly represents God's image in the world. Adam and Eve and other human beings reflect the glory of God into creation imperfectly, more so because of sin. But Christ is not a reflection of God's glory. Christ is God's glory in the world. Christ is God's glory in the flesh, so that the glory of God shines from Christ into the world. And it's that glory of God shining from Christ into the world that restores our humanity and reinvigorates in us the image of God. How does this restoration, how does this transformation happen? Well, again, listen to the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 3 and then in 2 Corinthians 4. He says, "And we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, we all are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit." And then 2 Corinthians 4, verse 6. "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ." Where do we see the glory of God? Displayed in the face of Christ. Years hurried on. And when he lived past his fame, Trumbull Bounderby grew bitter and sailed back to Europe. Ethan's children took farms of their own, sowing and harvesting with the same tender hands of their father. And the years planted white hairs on Ethan's head and furrowed his cheeks with wrinkles. But his eyes did not change. He watched his children and his children's children with love, and he continued to gaze upon the great stone face. One day, close to sunset, Ethan sat under the freshly green maples on the common with his neighbors and the ancient Pastor Hooper. They spoke of long winters and blooming springs, of tasks started and finished. And when Ethan's granddaughter came to fetch him home for supper, talk had turned to the prophecy of the great stone face. "I'm afraid," said Pastor Hooper, "after all these years, I'll not see the prophecy fulfilled." "Well," said Ethan, drawing his granddaughter to him, "perhaps this one will see it come to pass." "But grandfather," she said, "the prophecy came true long ago." "What do you mean, child?" asked Pastor Hooper. And Ethan's granddaughter reached 2 slight fingers to her grandfather's face. She traced the arch of his rugged brow, the hollows of his eyes, the furrows of his cheeks, and then stopped her fingers tenderly on his lips. Sudden silence on the common. Some of the neighbors stood. "Child has seen deeper than all of us," whispered Pastor Hooper. And then all the townspeople looked, and they knew the truth. But Ethan smiled, shook his head, and taking the hand of his granddaughter, walked homeward. One of the fundamental principles of worship is we become like what we worship. Another reason idolatry is bad is that when we worship a deaf, dumb, blind idol, we ourselves become deaf, dumb, and blind to the truth all around us. We become like what we worship. So when we worship God's idol, when we organize our lives around Christ, when we fix our eyes on the face of Christ and focus on His glory, we become more and more like Him. And over the course of a lifetime, Christ's glory, Christ's wisdom, Christ's love, Christ's goodness becomes ours. And our original purpose as human beings created in God's image is restored. And when the children of God are glorified, all of creation rejoices. Because the ones God has created to represent God, to show the world what God is like, have been restored to their original purpose. I'd like us to stand now and read out loud a portion of a prayer known as St. Patrick's breastplate. And one of the things this prayer does is remind us to fix our eyes, our minds, our hearts on Christ, always. Please read out loud with me. Christ be with me, Christ within me, Christ behind me, Christ before me, Christ beside me, Christ to win me, Christ to comfort me and restore me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ in quiet, Christ in danger, Christ in hearts of all that love me, Christ in mouth of friend and stranger.